All right, everybody, welcome to the April Cocktails and Fishtales 2022 presentation. We're here with the fabulous Rebecca Mostow, and boy, is it a perfect event for this night. So while you get settled in, we would love to know where you're tuning in from, but we'll let Rebecca tell us her favorite cocktail and a wild fishtail while folks start getting online. So let us know.
Thanks, Dina. Yeah, I'm super excited to be here with you all talking about grass on this auspicious day. My favorite cocktail is Negroni. It's pretty classic. But yeah, I had a dear roommate who introduced me to Negronis so many years ago now, and I've just been obsessed with them ever since. So that's definitely my favorite cocktail. And my fish tail, I think I'll tell a whale tail. Sorry, I know, mammals. Yeah, so I am right now a grad student in Oregon, but before I started grad school, I worked at the Port Townsend Marine Science Center in Port Townsend, Washington, up on the Olympic Peninsula. And when I was up there, sort of almost at the very end of when I was going to finish my job in Port Townsend, we got a call that there was a whale, a juvenile gray whale floating in the shipping canal. And it was dead, and they needed somebody to sort of get rid of the gray whale. And did we, the Marine Science Center, want the bones of the whale? And I got this phone call from Cascadia Research, and I was like, no, we have too much to do. We're too busy. We're understaffed. We definitely don't want these whale bones. And somehow they went above my head, which was valid. I was an AmeriCorps member. That was appropriate. And they called the executive director of the organization, and she said, yes, we definitely want the whale bones. And then for the next several months, the last chunk of my time there was the process of getting that whale to shore, cleansing it, so getting all the flesh off of it, sinking it in the ocean to let the creatures eat all the flesh off of it, and then cleaning those bones. And it was the worst smell I've ever smelled.
I feel like it probably just lingers with you, and in the realm of like fish tails, like a whale this big, like
yeah,
that's very appropriate.
Yeah, it does linger. Marine mammal smell is like it's so oily, it like just you can't get it off you.
Yeah, sorry to any roommates, neighbors, people you're living
exactly.
with. That's lovely. Well, we have some people tuning in. So, of course, those of you who are watching from wherever you are, we'd love to know where you're watching from. So you can get comfortable using the comment section. Let us know where you're tuning in and maybe what beverage you're enjoying on this fine evening. And of course, as we go through this presentation, the comments is also where we'll ask you questions. So please interact with us there. Ask questions of your own, because this is your opportunity to have those questions answered live at the end of Rebecca's presentation. So I think from here, I just am so excited to be like reuniting some of these humans who have been important in my research history. And so I get to brag a little bit about being an REU student with you in the Alaska days. And so it's really fun to, follow up on these threads to see what kind of science these fabulous people are up to. And so with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you for your presentation.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Stina. I'm really excited to be able to share all of this with you all today. So yeah, I introduced myself a little bit, and the talk title that I'm going to present today is A Wild Grass Chase, Discovery and Impacts of a Novel Ecosystem Engineering Hybrid Beach Grass. And this work that I'm presenting today is part of my dissertation that I'm working on here at Oregon State University. So I'm here in Corvallis, Oregon. Okay, so the story that I'm going to tell today, we're going to start by talking about the cast of characters. So who are the scientists involved? Then we'll dive into some Pacific Northwest dune natural history. And I called this unnatural history because almost all the plants we're going to talk about today are actually not native. Then we'll transition into the part I call the botany of desire. Don't come at me, Michael Pollan. What I mean by that is we're going to talk about hybridization in plants and why it matters. Then we'll talk about this unexpected discovery. We'll talk about the hybrid and the consequences of this hybridization on the Pacific Northwest coast and the next steps in my research. But before we get too deep into that, I just always like to ask people if they've read Dune, or now if you've seen Dune. That's also a great answer. So if you've read Dune or seen Dune, if you could put that in the Facebook comments, I'd love to see if we're how sci-fi nerdy this group is. And the reason that I always ask this, I'll tell you a little bit while you're typing in the comments. The reason I always ask is because Frank Herbert was a Pacific Northwesterner, right? And he went down to the dunes on the Southern Oregon coast as a journalist and was down in the Florence area looking at these incredible dunes, this like giant shifting sandy landscape. And he was so inspired by our ecosystem that he wrote an entire book about it called Dune. And now a major motion picture. I don't know if we have results coming in, Stina.
We sure do. We have people who have read and seen it. Okay. I have listened to the audiobook, so I'm also in that camp. So yeah, cool. Lots of Dune fans.
Okay, some Dune fans. Okay, so I will keep all of my jokes about like Arrakis and sandworms and things of that nature. Okay, thanks everybody.
The crowd's going wild. Yes.
Good. Okay. Okay, so we're going to move on to this cast of characters section. So we'll start with me. My name is Rebecca Mostow. I am a PhD candidate at Oregon State University, and I grew up in Seattle. So I'm actually more of a Salish Sea, Puget Sound person than an outer coast kind of person. I grew up in Seattle, and then I went to school in Ohio. I've always been a little bit of a scientific omnivore. I've studied lots of different things in my career, including getting to do an RU with Stina up in Alaska, up in Juneau. Yeah, and I mentioned that I worked in my fishtail, my whale tail, that I worked at the Port Townsend Marine Science Center, where I spent a lot of my time with my head in fish tanks, like this picture shows. And I also got a chance to start working with citizen scientists at the Marine Science Center and some community science. And that was really inspiring to me, and we'll get to that at the end of this talk. Okay, another really important character is Dr. Sally Hacker, who is a professor here at OSU and is a coastal community ecologist in dunes and estuaries and the Rocky Intertidal. Sally Hacker is my advisor, and so I'm going to do no jokes at all about her. Moving on. I also just always like to mention that science is a team sport. So I'm going to talk about research that I've done today. And these are just a few of the amazing people who have been involved in the research with me. It is a huge group of wonderful people who have worked with me on this project. A few people I do want to highlight is Dr. Peter Ruggiero, who's here on the boat. Anytime you hear me talking about anything like the dune shape, like the shape of the dune and the impact of the grasses on the shape of the dune, that is work that's coming out of collaborations with Peter's lab. And then another important person is Felipe Barreto, who's down in the corner here. Felipe is a geneticist, and so any of the work where I talk about the genetics of the hybrid, population genetics, genomics, anything like that, that's work I'm doing in collaboration with Felipe. And then, of course, this is my lab, the Hacker Lab. We all study dunes and different coastal ecosystems. And my amazing lab mate, Risa, put this poster together for us when the first Dune movie came out. And Sally is saying, unstudied dunes are the mind killer. Okay, during Zoom talks, I like to sort of orient us to where we are in space a little bit. So here is beautiful Washington and Oregon, right? And here's you and me. So you're up in Gig Harbor, Tacoma area, and I'm all the way down here in Corvallis, Oregon in the Willamette Valley. And we're going to focus in on basically the beaches that are between us, the sandy coastline in between sort of like northern Oregon coastline and the southern Washington coastline. This is a really, really sandy zone, lots of sandy beaches through that area, not a lot of rocky headlands. It's a great place to study dunes. And we're going to zoom in now to the natural history of this place. I'm going to talk about the history of the ecosystem and how it's changed over time. And the story of how it's changed over time is a story of colonialism, of the impact of European colonizers and the plants that they introduced. So I think it's important to start by recognizing that the land that I'm talking about, this ecosystem, is the traditional homelands of the Chinook, Quinault, Lower Chehalis, Willapa, Clatsop, Lower Chinook, Tillamook, Siletz, and Nestucca peoples. And those peoples were forcibly removed, violently and forcibly removed from their homelands, some of those groups under treaties and some untreated. And so the living descendants of these peoples are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians, the Confederated Tribes of the Chehalis Reservation, and the Chinook Nation, who are actually still seeking federal recognition. They were untreated, and they're still seeking federal recognition. So the story I'm going to tell is about ecological change, and there are parallels to this history of forcible removal of Native peoples. But I think it's important to say the removal of the Native peoples is a much more violent and tragic story than the ecological change that I'm going to describe. Okay, so zooming in on the sort of native natural state of this dune ecosystem on the outer coast. The native state of the dunes is actually this sort of black and white picture in the background. So it's these low, non-linear dunes, super sparsely vegetated, really dynamic, tons of shifting sand. There's a really high diversity of plants, but those plants are kind of spread out, not very densely growing. And in fact, in the Lower Chehalis language, there's a word Chehalis, which means shifting sand. And Chehalis in English became Chehalis, was transliterated as Chehalis. And so that's a place name for some shifting sandy places. And it's the name of a couple groups of people. So the people of the shifting sand is how the Lower Chehalis at least often describe themselves. So there was an understanding of the ecosystem by the native peoples that this was sort of it was a dynamic place, and this was sort of the state that it was in. However, it did not stay like this. If you've been to the Oregon and Washington coast, you know there's been some dramatic change out there. So in the early 1900s, when European colonizers moved to the coast, they started building railroads and hard infrastructure, and the shifting sand became a huge problem. And so they introduced these beach grasses, and they planted them like that black and white picture in the bottom corner there. And the beach grasses started to be introduced in the early 1900s. That continued through today, actually, but like high levels through the 1970s. And these beach grasses did exactly what they were introduced to do. They spread, they took over the dunes, they built tall, linear dunes that are densely vegetated and super stable. They've stabilized that shifting sand. So to give you a sense of the scale of that change, I've zoomed out. This is Pacific City, Oregon, which is one of the furthest south beaches we'll really think about today. And on the left, we have sort of older aerial imagery, and on the right, newer aerial imagery. And what you can see is that on the left, there's lots of white open sand, and on the right, there's lots of green vegetated dune. And the other thing I want you to notice is that it's not only densely vegetated, it's also densely populated. There's lots of housing and development happening here. And the reason that this development is possible is that these grasses stabilized the dunes and increased coastal protection. So there's been some, positive for humans impacts of this beach grass planting. They increase coastal protection by building almost like a seawall on the coast, and they increase the stability of the sand, making these communities possible out there. But there are also some negative consequences of beach grass introduction. They decrease plant species richness, they outcompete native plants, and they decrease habitat for native animals, including the western snowy plover, which is threatened or endangered. Okay, so there's been these positive consequences and negative consequences, and ever since their introduction, the beach grasses have presented these sort of trade-offs in ecosystem services and complex management choices. So that's sort of the big picture overview, but what I haven't mentioned yet is that there's actually two species of beach grasses. I keep saying beach grasses plural, and I really do mean two different ones. There are two species that were introduced, Ammophila arenaria and Ammophila breviligulata, and these two species have differential effects on dune morphology, so the actual shape of the dune, coastal protection, and biodiversity. One of the dunes, Ammophila breviligulata, which is in blue here and will be in blue for the rest of the talk, was predominantly introduced in the north, and the other one was predominantly introduced in the south. Ammophila arenaria was mostly introduced from southern Washington south. And so because of that, there's this area of overlap between the two species, and that's where we're going to zoom in for the rest of the talk. I want to talk a little more about the differences between these two different types of grasses. Okay, so there's Ammophila arenaria, which is European beachgrass and is native to Western Europe. And then there's Ammophila breviligulata, which is American beachgrass and native to the US Northeast and Midwest. So if you've ever been to the dunes around the Great Lakes or out to the coast, anywhere from like Virginia north through Maine and a sandy beach anywhere in there, you've seen American beachgrass. These two species look really similar, but there's actually one character trait that's really easy to differentiate between the two species, and it's the ligule. So the ligule is this thin piece of tissue between the leaf blade and the stem. And the way that this is a little bit silly, but the way that I like to tell people to remember the ligules is to look for the armpit hair of the grass. So you can imagine that the grass is sort of standing with its arms up like this. And if you look at the place where the leaf intersects with the stem, there's the armpit, and that's the armpit hair, that's the ligule. So if it has a long pointy ligule, if it has long armpit hair, it's Ammophila arenaria. And if it has a short flat topped ligule, almost no armpit hair, that's American beachgrass, Ammophila breviligulata. Okay, so those are our two species. We're going to zoom into the differences between those species in their ecology. So Ammophila arenaria dominated dunes tend to be taller and steeper than those dominated by Ammophila breviligulata. And that is because of a positive feedback loop between grass growth and sand deposition. So Ammophila arenaria grows more densely, so it builds taller, steeper dunes than Ammophila breviligulata. Ammophila arenaria dominated dunes also tend to have greater plant species richness. There's one other species of dune grass that you're likely to see out on the beaches in Oregon and Washington, and that's Lamus mollis, or American dune grass. This is actually our native grass. And I'll just do a brief aside to say, I've been using these Latin names, these like alphabet soup Latin names that I know can be sort of exclusionary to people, and people bristle about them. But I do it because the common names of these species are too confusing. So American dune grass is our native species of grass, Lamus mollis, and American beach grass is our invasive species of grass, Ammophila breviligulata. So I find that the common names are too confusing, so I stopped using them, and I'm sorry about that. But yeah, this is Lamus mollis. It also builds dunes, but they're not tall linear dunes. They're more sort of low hummocky. They have really high plant species richness, and the snowy plovers like to nest in them. Now, all of the sort of information that I summarized thus far about the different types of grasses and the different dunes they build, the way we know that is through long-term monitoring of the coasts. So every 3 years or so, somebody from the Hacker Lab returns to these beaches, those triangles up and down the coast on the map, and does transects across the shape of the dune to get what the shape of the actual sand is. And then also we do surveys of what grasses grow there. So by combining those two data sets, we can understand what's the impact of grass growth on dune shape. And it was actually during one of these surveys back in 2012 that a lab mate of mine found a grass that just looked weird. It looked like intermediate between the two Ammophila species. It had an intermediate length ligule, so that armpit hair was like a weird length. And it happened to be flowering at a time that nothing else was. And throughout the course of that season, he actually found it, this is Ruben Beal, found it at 3 more sites in Washington and Oregon. And so he asked the question, is this beach grass a hybrid? And that question, like, is this weird thing that we found on the dune, what's going on with it? Is it a hybrid? That was sort of when I joined the lab in 2016. That's been the driving question of my dissertation. And for 5 years, it's like pretty much all I've thought about. So before we answer that question, is this a hybrid? I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about hybridization. So a hybrid is the offspring of parents from 2 different species. So not this, right? But this. So a mule is a hybrid between a horse and a donkey. A liger is a hybrid between a lion and a tiger. But those are animals, and actually plants are way more likely to hybridize than animals. So you've also seen some hybrids in the grocery store, a pluot, a tangelo, right? These are artificial hybrids produced by humans. But artificial hybridization is not the only kind that happens. There's actually a lot of natural hybridization out in the wild. And I'm just showing some examples of hybridization in systems where it's like been really well studied. Hybridization is fairly common in the wild, and it has been shown, especially in plants, to be a driver of sort of dramatic evolutionary change or adaptation. In plants especially, it seems like hybridization causes a mixing, sort of unexpected combinations of genes end up together, and it produces weird and unexpected traits that often can be evolutionarily advantageous. And so hybridization in plants is often this driver of rapid evolution or rapid change. So that's why hybridization matters. That's why it was really exciting to think that maybe there was a hybrid beachgrass on our coast. Okay, so let's dive into the main questions that I have about this hybrid. The first question is just like, is it a hybrid? What's going on here? The second is, okay, if it's a hybrid, then how is this hybrid grass interacting with the other species of grasses? Is it competing with them? Is it facilitating them? What's going on there? And if it is competing, what does that say for like its spread along the coast or its prevalence over time? Is it going to persevere in these ecosystems? And then the last, but maybe most important question is how much is out there, right? I said when I joined the lab, there were 4 known sites of the hybrid. So is there more of it? Is it just these 4 sites? So those are the 3 main questions. And here are the methods I use to investigate them. To answer the question, is it a hybrid? We looked at the morphology. So how does the plant look? We did a little bit of genotyping, some genome size. To answer this question about how will the grass interact with other species, we did a common garden interaction experiment that I'll tell you a lot about today. And then finally, to answer this question about how much is out there, we did some citizen science. I'm calling it grassroots science here because I cannot resist. And I'll tell you more about that towards the end. So let's start with this question. Is this plant a hybrid? Is this weird thing rhubarb found on the beach, is it a hybrid? So the way that we investigated this, the first thing we did is we just collected hundreds of plants of the hybrid and the 2 Ammophila species, and we measured a suite of traits on all of these individual plants. Some of those traits are important for identifying those grasses in the field, and some of them are important for dune building potential. So remember I told you that the 2 species of beach grasses build different shaped dunes because of how they grow. The growth form of the plant feeds back to the growth form of the dune. And so if this hybrid has a different growth form, it might build different shaped dunes. So we measured all these traits, and I'm just going to show you a few of them. So first we'll start with ligule length. Remember, this is our armpit hair. And on the y-axis is the trait that we measured, and on the x-axis are our species. And it's AMAR is my code for Ammophila arenaria, HYBR is the code for the hybrid, and AMBR is the code for Ammophila breviligulata. So what you can see here is Ammophila arenaria. I already told you this. It has a long ligule. Ammophila breviligulata has a short little ligule, and then right in the middle of the hybrid has this intermediate length ligule. We saw the same pattern for leaf width. If I look at how wide the leaves are, the hybrid is intermediate. However, when we look at shoot height, so how tall are the individual plants, I found that the hybrid was taller. And this result just keeps getting backed up in every study that we do. The hybrid is definitely taller than the parent species. And finally, we looked at the number of shoots per plant, which is a little bit of a proxy for density. And in this project, we found that the hybrid had an intermediate number of shoots per plant. Okay, so from the morphology, we can say, okay, the hybrid looks different from the parent species. We can quantify those differences. We can use those differences to find it in the field. And some of those traits in which it differs from its parent species might be important for its ability to build dunes. The next thing I did was I looked at the genome size. So literally how much genetic material is in every cell of the plant. And I'll just show this really fast and just say that, you know, the Ammophila arenaria is on the left. It has a lower ligule size. Ammophila breviligulata has a larger, sorry, not ligule size, genome size. And then the hybrid has an almost exactly intermediate genome size, which is great evidence that it's getting half of its genome from Ammophila arenaria, half of its genome from Ammophila breviligulata, like what we would see in a first generation hybrid cross. The next thing I did was some SNP genotyping. So what I did was I sequenced a bunch of DNA from these different individuals from different species, and I put it into this clustering program that basically colors each individual, which is represented by a column here, and colors them by different groups. So this clustering program is saying that every Ammophila arenaria column or individual should be in the red group, every Ammophila breviligulata individual should be in the blue group, and then all of the hybrids belong half in the blue group and half in the red group. So again, this is some really compelling evidence that what we're seeing is a first generation hybrid cross between these two parent species. And all of the data that I've shown just thus far was published in Ecosphere last year. Okay, so we answered the question. Is it a hybrid? Yes, it is. Surprise, it's in fact a hybrid. And so the next question that comes up is like, oh, yikes, it's a hybrid. Like, what do we do? What does that mean? What's the impact on dune shape, coastal protection? Is it going to spread? The answering of that first question produced a million more questions. And so one of those questions was, how will this hybrid interact with the parent species? And to answer that question, I installed a very large species interaction common garden competition experiment at the Hatfield Marine Science Center down here in Newport, Oregon. The setup of the experiment was basically I went out to the field and collected a bunch of plants, brought them back to Hatfield, and filled these geotextile bags, like sandbags, basically meter cubed sandbags with sand, and then planted different combinations of plants in those bags together. Here's an overview of the experiment. So the experiment has 9 treatments. So those are different combinations of plants growing together. So either I had, the hybrid growing by itself at a low density, the hybrid growing by itself, but at a higher density. And then I had the hybrid versus each of the parent species. And then I did the same thing for the 2 parent species. So there's 9 total treatments and 6 replicate blocks and 1 very tired graduate student. So we installed this experiment in March of 2020. So huge thank you and shout out to all of the people who helped me install it. We finished planting plants on the day before the governor's stay-at-home order. So it was a wild time to be doing science. And then every month from March 2020 until October 2021, I returned to this experiment. I added sand because the grasses need sand deposition in order to grow. And I also counted the number of stems in each one of those bags. And so I monitored the experiment over time. And so I'm going to show you some data from this experiment, but it's all pretty preliminary. But yeah, so I monitored the experiment every month for its whole run. And here's some of those data. So I'm just showing the monoculture treatments. So treatments where it was just one species growing only with itself and nothing else. And on the x-axis, we have the date that I did the survey, and on the y-axis, the stem density. And I'm showing you sort of these pictures of what the bags looked like when we planted them in March 2020 and what they looked like when we pulled them in October 2021. So here I'm just showing the growth, the number of stems per bag of Ammophila breviligulata. You can see they started really low. That's in the very beginning of this treatment. We planted a bunch of plants in there. There's probably, 12 stems in that bag starting out. And then they sort of chugged along for the whole first year. And then in the second year, there was this big increase in growth. Now I'm going to layer on Ammophila arenaria. So here's the growth rate of Ammophila arenaria over time. And I think the big takeaway, right, is that Ammophila arenaria experienced its fastest growth. It put on the most stems, grew most quickly in that first summer, and kind of late summer was its biggest pulse of growth. But then it kind of leveled off and it didn't really increase throughout the rest of the experiment. But the Ammophila breviligulata bag, those bags grew pretty slowly for the whole first year of the experiment, and then had this big increase in their growth rate in the early spring, or sort of late spring, early summer of the second year of the experiment. So if we had ended the experiment in January of 2021, which is weird to think about that date in terms of science, this timeline, like monitoring the experiment over the course of the pandemic, there's a lot of sort of overlap in the timeline with world events, but just think about the plants. If we had cut the experiment off in January of 2021, we would have seen this huge difference in the number of stems between Ammophila arenaria and Ammophila breviligulata. But luckily we let it grow for another almost full year, another full growing season. And we saw that the rates of growth between the two parent species are pretty different. They put on their stems at different times. Now I'm going to layer on the hybrid on top of this. And so I think the big takeaway for this from this graph is that by the end of the experiment, the hybrid had extremely high stem densities in every bag. This is a trait with really important implications for dune building potential. Denser stem growth often leads to taller dunes, more sand accretion and taller dunes. So that's a sign that we might be looking at a beach grass that can build really, really tall dunes. The other thing to notice that I just think is fascinating is to look at sort of the trend line, the growth line of the hybrid. And like, it looks to me like you just added the two lines of the parent species together, and what you get is the hybrid. Like, it's like this perfect additive line. It's kind of mind-blowing to me. Like, anytime the parent species are increasing, are putting on stems, the hybrid is also putting on stems. So that was the experiment over time. That's what the density of my project looks like over time. And then 18 months had passed, and it was time to really investigate. Okay, so we started this grass face-off, and now we need to know who won. And to know that, we really need to look at these plants that have been trapped in sand for 18 months. And so to do that, we took these bags, we cut them open, and I sort of had this vision that like all the sand would fall out, and then I would just pull the plants out of the bags. But that's not what happened at all. The plants were basically root bound in these bags. After 18 months and with lots of healthy sand addition, they were really healthy and they were pretty much root bound. And so to remove the plants from the sand and get all of the sand off ended up being a almost month-long process of, we call this the demolition. And basically what we did was we tore the bags, the plastic bags off of the experimental units, and then we sprayed them with hoses for hours until we could wash away all the sand. We built these, dug these sort of tunnels for the water to go through, these like ditches. And in the end, we had a plant like the one that Dakota, who's an undergrad who I've worked with, and I are holding up in that last picture. These huge plants with tons of below ground biomass intact. As far as I know, no one has taken as much care as I have in a beach grass growth experiment to really preserve the below ground biomass. And so I have some cool below ground biomass data to look at. And that's what I'm going to show next. Is so in the end point, at the very end of the experiment, how much mass, how much total, plant material was there in these bags. So I'm going to show a lot of data on a single slide. And what I want you to note is just that the x-axis is going to be the treatments. Here I'm only showing the monocultures, so only plants growing with just their same species. And then on the y-axis is the total biomass, so above ground, leaves and stuff, and below ground, roots and rhizomes. And it's in grams. And so just to kind of orient you, 2,000 grams is like 4.5 pounds, somewhere in there. So like half a bag of flour, something like that. They were very heavy when they were soaking wet, but we dried them. So so the big takeaway from this part is just to see that in our low density and our high density treatments, we can see differences in the end biomass. And to just highlight that the hybrid, which is here in purple, the purple outlined boxes, the hybrid had more biomass than either parent species in the end, in both the low density and the high density treatments. So now I'm just going to add on our interaction treatments. So here are bags where we had both Ammophila arenaria and Ammophila breviligulata growing together, or Ammophila breviligulata and the hybrid growing together, competing for resources and space. And the big takeaway is to just compare the height of those little boxes with the height of their respective species boxes at the low density treatment. So if you look at this Ammophila arenaria box here, growing in competition with Ammophila breviligulata, you can see that it is much smaller, much lower biomass than when it was growing by itself with no competition. So there's a strong competitive effect here. And the other big takeaway is just to say that the hybrid in competition was still growing bigger than either parent species. So when we put them together, the hybrids, there was still more of the hybrid taking up the bag, filling up space. Okay, I've showed sort of like the overall values. So here, this is, I'm showing the total biomass values. From these values, I calculated some interaction indices. All you really need to know about this interaction index is that it's a way of measuring competition between plants. And if the index is negative, if there's a negative number in a box, that means that there's a competitive interaction happening. If it was 0, that would mean no interaction. And if it's positive, that would mean there's a facilitative interaction happening. So the plants are helping each other out. And the way you can read this little chart is you read the effect of Ammophila arenaria on Ammophila breviligulata, for example, will be right here in this box. Okay, so here are the results. Every interaction I've measured, every way I cut it, there are negative interactions between these plants. They are competing really hard for resources and for space with one another. They're even competing when I increase the density, they're competing against their conspecifics or individuals that are of the same species. The really important takeaway from this little chart is just to say that the largest interaction is the effect of the hybrid on Ammophila breviligulata. So when Ammophila breviligulata was forced to grow with the hybrid, it had the greatest reduction in its biomass. It really struggled. And yeah, the biomass data, when you just look at it overall, really bears that up, right? Okay, so we asked this question, how will the hybrid interact with other grasses? And the answer is competitively, and very competitively, in fact. And there's a ton more data from that project that I still need to analyze. Yeah, so there's a lot more fun results to come, including analyses of below ground biomass, above ground biomass, and really trying to dig down into, can we understand the mechanisms of that competition? How is the hybrid outcompeting its parents so dramatically? Okay, the final question is how much of this hybrid is out there? And so remember when I started this talk, I told you that we only knew about 4 sites where the hybrid existed. There were 3 up in Long Beach, Washington and Grayland, and 1 down in Pacific City, Oregon. This is what it looked like when I joined the lab. This is what we knew about the hybrid. Since I've joined the lab, another graduate student has started working with us. And between the 2 of us and a cadre of volunteers, we've actually found 117 total patches of the hybrid in Washington and Oregon. So the map has grown quite dramatically. The range is still about the same. So we're seeing hybrid from around Ocean Shores, Washington, all the way down through Pacific City, Oregon. Although we haven't found any hybrid between Fort Stevens, Washington and Pacific City, Oregon, which is a large area of coastline. And this figure was put together and this research was done almost exclusively by my lab mate, Risa Askeruth, who is a master's student here at Oregon State and who made this incredible dune poster. And Risa has been really leading the charge on trying to identify how much hybrid is out in the world. And the way that she's done this is by searching for it pretty extensively. And also she's been returning to patches where we know the hybrid exists and looking at what is the shape of the dune at those sites. And is the sort of hybrid patch spreading over time? So there's going to be some amazing research coming out of Risa's master's thesis soon. So the other thing to notice about this graph, this figure, is that there are some big gaps in the map. So like if you look at the northern part of the Grayland Peninsula, right? Or I don't know, all the way from Fort Stevens down to Pacific City. There are these areas where we don't have any hybrid on the map. And that's not because there's no hybrid there. That's just because we haven't had the opportunity to search there yet. And so we have teamed up with Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition and their Oregon Coast Watch program to get community members involved in searching for this hybrid. So we do that through iNaturalist. And I would love to hear if people are familiar with iNaturalist. So if you've used iNaturalist before, will you put it in the chat, yes or no? And if you want to share, you could share like what you've used iNaturalist for, if it's birds or plants or snails or BioBlitz or whatever. I'd love to hear. And while you're putting your iNaturalist experiences into the chat, I'll just tell you, in case people aren't familiar, iNaturalist is a social network whose goals are to connect people to nature and to generate scientifically valuable biodiversity data. And it just so happens that like those are my goals too. So we're a pretty good match. And through iNaturalist, I've created this project that basically pulls in every beach grass identification made on the Northwest coast, pulls them all into this project. And this is actually an old screenshot. There's actually over 900 observations of beach grasses in the project now, and over 600 observers of beach grass. So the project is sort of pulling in all these observations and keeping tabs on everything. And also I use it to, I identify people's observations. So I go into our project and I double check pretty much all of the observations of beach grass that are coming in. But the project also hosts some important identification materials. So there are ID guides of all different kinds. There are links to trainings and webinars, all different stuff that I've produced to help people learn how to identify the grass. This project was also rolled out in spring of 2020. And so it's been exclusively online until this year when it's going to start to be in person again. And so there's an opportunity for in-person trainings. Stina, are you hearing from people on the Facebook about iNaturalist use?
Yeah, it looks like we have one person, Frederick, is mostly using it for plants and fungi.
Great, amazing. I love to hear it.
And I know we've used it in the past for like a BioBlitz type thing.
Yeah.
And I would say Rachel, our education director, is the most savvy in the iNaturalist department and has used it more than I have.
Cool. Yeah, it's a really cool tool. It basically works the same as eBird, if you've ever used that for birding. All you do is you upload a picture of any living thing and you can say what you think it is. You can sort of propose an identification. And then other users will come in and either agree or disagree with your identification. So I'm serving as kind of the agree disagree for the beach grasses in a really big way, especially for the hybrid, because so few people know how to identify it. But yeah, it's an amazing tool for my project, but also just for lots of fun things if you want to get involved with BioBlitzes or learn more from your community about how to identify the living things in your world. Yeah, so as I was saying, we've been all online. I've been teaching people to identify grasses exclusively online. And now in the next couple of months, there are actually going to be in-person trainings. So there is going to be a beach grass identification training and iNaturalist use training on May 21st at Sunset Beach Recreation Area, which is up in Northern Oregon, and on July 7th at Fort Stevens State Park. So if you want to get involved with any of those, we'd love your help. And you can email Jessie at Oregon Shores, or you could email me if you can't remember that. Yeah, we'd love to see you there. It's kind of a trek from Gig Harbor, but who knows, maybe you're out at the beach already. Okay, so we answered this question, how much of the hybrid is out there? And the answer is really a ton. There is so much more hybrid known now than when I started working in this lab. One of the hybrid patches is named Surf Trip Hybrid because it's a hybrid that I found when I was not supposed to be working. I was on the Long Beach Peninsula on a surf trip. I was specifically not looking at the dunes, and I just happened to glance up and I saw a weird looking plant and I was like, oh no, I have to check. And I walked over there and what do you know? It's the hybrid. So there's a lot of it out there. It's a pretty fun project to be involved in because I call it a wild grass chase, but it's like a wild grass chase where like the goose is not that sneaky. Like you can find it, it's out there. It's not that hard. So you get a lot of satisfaction from being involved in this project. And some of those 117 patches that we found have been identified by community members out in the wild. Okay. So to wrap up, we put all of these pieces of data that I've described together, and the conclusion is sort of surprising and maybe a little overwhelming. So these Ammophila beach grasses, the ones that build the iconic Oregon coast dunes, are hybridizing along our coastline. And we know that this hybrid occurs at more than 117 sites and that it competes pretty intensely with its parent species. So as I mentioned before, like when we hear about this discovery, it leads to a million more questions. So we have questions about the impact of this hybrid on coastal protection. What kind of dunes is it going to build? And if it builds different shaped dunes than the parent species, how will that impact the way those dunes protect the human communities built in their lee? The discovery of the hybrid also produces all these questions about biodiversity conservation. So how will the hybrid interact with other native plant species? What about how does it serve as bird habitat? What about elk habitat? Like a lot of these areas are used by lots of different plants and animal species. Finally, I have a ton of questions about the population genetics of the hybrid that I am investigating, including, can the hybrid backcross with its parent species? So can it reproduce with the parents? And if so, is it sort of serving as a mediator, serving as a bridge between these two species to allow gene flow between them? So a lot of questions. And finally, the ecological interactions with the parent species. We know that it's competing, but what is the implication of that competition? Is it going to spread, or is the competition so great and so sort of mutual that it'll be stuck in one place? So lots of areas for further research. I'm going to close with just a few thanks. Thanks to the research partners, obviously my advisor and Dr. Barreto, as well as Ruben Beal and Eli Meyer, who really started the genetic work on this project. Tons of fieldwork help and grass measuring help. And of course, the amazing funding sources that have made this research possible, including Oregon Sea Grant, the National Science Foundation, and the Washington Native Plant Society, in fact. And with that, I'm going to close, and I would love to take any questions that you have.
Excellent. Thank you for the gratuitous sunset here at the end.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Can't resist.
Well, normally in the in-person things, the crowd goes wild. So we'll let people pour their love in on you, as well as add their questions in the chat. To start, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Really interesting to hear about how the different types of grass species kind of create a different dune shape, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And so like figuring out what the hybrid is, like that feels like a cool thing to be able to look at a beach and be like, oh, steep dunes must be this type of grass. So is there any like dune shape?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I expect that it will build different shaped dunes than the parent species. The challenge is that it's fairly morphologically variable. When I look at the traits that define dune shape, I see a lot of variability in the hybrid, which makes sense when we think about a first generation hybrid. It's like mashing together random genes from these two different species. So predicting what the end result is a little bit challenging. What we do know is that it grows definitely way more densely. In the same conditions, it'll grow way more densely than the parent species. That makes it seem like it might build a taller dune. But the other thing that I found is that it produces as much lateral growth as Ammophila breviligulata, the parent species that builds the wider dunes. So those two things together make me feel like it's going to be like a really tall and really wide dune. Maybe it's like really tall and like almost as wide as an Ammophila breviligulata dominated dune. But yeah, they're going to be big. My lab mate, Risa Askeruth, whose work I've referenced a couple times here, has actually been returning repeatedly to sites where the hybrid grows, just the hybrid in a monoculture in a little patch. And she's been taking these GPS surveys where she walks over the hybrid patch, and she goes back super regularly. So she's looking to see if there's change in the dune shape over time. And with that change, could she predict what it's going to look like in the future?
That's some cool science right there. Might also make us wonder, what size sandworms are hiding under those things?
Oh my gosh, I know.
Jokes back around.
I cut the pictures of all of the weird larvae that I found in the dune, but there are some bizarre looking worms in sand dunes in Oregon. Yeah, a lot of them are beetle larvae. Okay. I didn't know this until I was digging in the dunes all the time, and I wonder if Frank Herbert like saw some June beetle larva and was like, what if
I could write that? Yeah. Let's go. Awesome. We have Frederick tuning in with a question, wondering,
Frederick,
are there any other places in North America where this hybrid appears other than the Pacific Northwest?
Such a good question. I think this might be my dear friend Eric Dowell.
Oh,
I
yeah, it's Frederick Earl Dow. There's
ah,
a lot of names on that one. I was just
welcome.
first
I'm
one. I was
glad
like,
you're here,
yeah.
Eric. Yeah. So the two species of beachgrass, Ammophila breviligulata and Ammophila arenaria, they're both not native to the Northwest. And this is the only place in the world where they co-occur. I have been searching iNaturalist and herbarium specimens and lots of other sources trying to figure out if there's anywhere in the world where both of these grass species have been planted, because they actually both have been planted in like tons of other weird places. They're in Australia, they're in the like east coast of South America, they've been planted. Pretty much lots of places where European people have colonized, they have brought these grasses and introduced them to stabilize the sand. So as far as I know,
A
there's
quick question on the introduction. Is that a purposeful introduction or like, whoops, accidentally
yeah,
brought this grass on my foot?
it's almost
Or-
all intentional introduction. Yeah, they're really extensively planted to stabilize sand and to build dunes. Yeah, super good question, Stina. Yeah, so as far as I know, as far as I can figure out, there's no other place in the world where they both grow together. So there's no other place in the world where this hybrid could be produced. Yeah, there's a lot of implications for that and some parallels in other systems, but I'll leave it there.
Wild. Has a follow-up question here. Also, are there any studies or info about which of these species is more successful in colonizing newly disturbed habitats or more highly disturbed habitats?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, the dunes are, I think we can think of them as a high disturbance habitat just naturally, right? I went out to the dunes in the winter and spring of this past year and just looked at the just volume of sand that's getting deposited on the grasses. The erosion at the toe of the dune and then the volume of sand is just like so dramatic that dunes are sort of just a really high disturbance system. A question about like if they got like if a big chunk of the dune got ripped out, like which species would take over quicker? I think we would probably go with Ammophila breviligulata. It grows more laterally. That's our American beachgrass. It grows more laterally, and so it always outcompetes the other species, Ammophila arenaria, when we sort of do those face-off experiments against each other. And it seems like it just takes over space more quickly. And we've seen that in the wild, actually. Ammophila breviligulata was introduced actually second. Ammophila arenaria was already dominant on the coastline, and then Ammophila breviligulata was introduced, and then it took over the dune, the foredune, the dune closest to the ocean really quickly.
Love all the fun little sciencey things you get to add to, you know, the battling beach grasses. I appreciate all those funny little quips that you have about your area of study here.
The face off, yeah.
Delightful.
Yeah, if anyone has any grass like grass face off puns, this is something I've been thinking about a lot recently. Is like I thought about Battle of the Bags was what I was doing for a little bit, like Battle of the Bands, but I didn't feel like it really translated. Anyway, send them my way. I'd love your puns, Eric.
Yeah, we are here for the puns for sure.
Yeah.
Well, we might even include them in our print newsletter for you.
Oh,
so.
that would be amazing. Yeah.
All right, taking a look over here to see if there's some more questions coming in. Need some more grass curiosity here, people. Let's go. What are you wondering? Well, I have another question while folks are maybe deciding on what they might want to ask you. Is what's up with the plovers?
Yeah.
Why don't they like hang out in the non-native beach grasses? Is it a diversity thing, a steep thing? Like, what's their deal?
They really, it's very sweet. They like to nest in open sand. I mean, like that's the system that they evolved in, right? Is like open sand with not a lot of vegetation. People who study plovers say that they often find their nest actually like there'll be like one tuft of grass and then they're like just right next to it. So like it's like a little sheltering thing happening, but they just don't like these dense dunes. There's not enough open space for them to nest. And so they won't nest in the dunes. And yeah, the beachgrass spread was this huge negative impact on the plovers. But there are some areas in Washington, Oregon, and California where land managers have done sort of dune leveling and dune grass removal in order to make habitat for the plovers. And they come back. They're like, oh yeah, I remember this. I can live here. I can nest here. And it's really cool to see the really effective management of these birds in a lot of places.
They're really choosy with their sunset views. You know, you can't
They
have all
really
that grass
are.
blocking the.
Yeah, exactly.
Ooh, blades have been drawn.
Oh,
Suggestion
great.
for,
Oh, so good. Thank you.
schooling.
That's a great one.
Frederick Dowell. Love that. Yeah, that's looking like that might be our questions for the evening. Of course, this whole video will be posted for your enjoyment later, and we'll put it up on YouTube as well. So I would suppose if people have more questions, they can follow up and we'll, you know, get those emailed questions your way.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
again, we just want to say thank you so much for talking dune grass with us. This is one of those subjects that I think you know, people might be skeptical. It's not the charismatic megafauna, but like, I'm really stoked to learn how cool all this is, and the hybridization of all of that is just what a wild thing to be working on. And congratulations on getting close to the end of your PhD here with this project.
Yeah, thanks, Gina.
So with that, we'll go ahead and do just a couple Harbor Wild Watch announcements. I would be remiss not to plug our volunteer training. If you want to get out with the beach out with us on the beach this summer, I'm too excited. We get to be with people again. And so we're doing our naturalist training. And so it's not too late to join because we are doing that hybrid model of digital and in person. So all our meetings are recorded and you can catch up and you won't have missed a thing other than that in-person interaction. And then we'll do a field trip. So get in on volunteer training if you're interested. And of course, join us at the beach this summer, as well as stay tuned on those Wild Side weekly newsletter things for all the other fun programs we have going on. With that, we'll go ahead and raise our glasses. Cheers to you, Rebecca. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll sign off here. So, and of course, thanks to everyone out there watching and learning and having fun. So appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Awesome. Learn, have fun.